Hello, my name is Tabitha Davies. I'm a certified professional dog trainer, associate certified dog behavior consultant, certified trick dog instructor, fear-free certified professional, as well as a professional nutrition coach certified. I run all big canines in the Palm Springs, California area, and this presentation is on muddling through marketing buzzwords to find the proper professional to work with you and your dog. The main focus on this presentation is basically the common industry terms and buzzwords that you commonly hear when you are looking for a professional to help you and your dog. It's going to have the goal of teaching you how to understand what you're reading in ads for local training behavior professionals, how to find a properly educated and credentialed professional, what questions to ask, and when to know to walk away. Have you ever heard any of the following terms in relation to dog training? Balanced, communication, correction, dominant. Your dog should work because they want to. Alpha, leader, respect, like the mother dog does. Control, purely positive, force-free, fear-free, credentialed, certified, stubborn, master trainer, disobedient, canine, LIMA, guaranteed, fix anything, rehabilitated, cured, cookie pusher, stimulation doesn't hurt, requires a heavier hand, behaviorist or behavioralist, or behavioral trainer. Some fun facts about the dog training and behavioral industry, and this is on a global level, is that it's not regulated, which means that anyone can wake up one day and decide to call themselves a dog trainer. Now, there are some countries where you do have to have a license and a certification or a credential. However, the majority of them do not. What that means is that someday somebody can wake up and decide to call themselves a dog trainer. They can charge for services to train someone's dog, and they can do this with little to no experience or education, which means that if they find that alpha rolling your dog or using a boinking towel on the dog to hit them and tell them to do something wrong is appropriate, that they get to do it because there's no oversight. What this means for the general public is that it's harder to weed out good marketing from good training. Everybody has seen at least once in their life one of those magical before and after videos, be it on a commercial on TV or something on their Facebook news feed, where it looks like the dog went from this crazy, aggressive, or out of control dog to a nice, obedient, calm dog that the person is now happily walking. When things like this occur, there's a higher chance of choosing someone who talks a good game, who shows those magical videos, but it can make things worse because of the use of outdated and less ethical methods that have a higher chance of fallout. And what fallout means is that if you're using an interventional strategy, the consequence of the use of that interventional strategy is that it can actually make behavior worse through behavior suppression. So it could temporarily look like it's actually much better, but we're really creating like a ticking time bomb within the dog before they just can't handle it anymore. It makes it harder for the general public to determine how and who to hire to address their needs for them and their dog. And there's no regulatory bodies to oversee the ethical treatment of dogs, their owners, or processes pertaining to dog training or behavior. So to put that into perspective, veterinarians have to, basically answer to the veterinary medical board of each state or their country. Doctors have a medical board that they have to answer to that can oversee complaints from, clients or patients. Cosmetologists, estheticians, all have credentialing licensing boards, nursing boards. If somebody brings a complaint against you, be it a colleague or somebody from the general public, they have to do a thorough investigation on it. In dog training, that doesn't exist. So for the most part, again, without those exceptions of a few countries, for the most part, when something happens and someone has a problem in the United States, for example, they can go to the Consumer Protection Agency for their state. But because there's no regulation on dog training, nothing's really going to happen unless they've committed fraud. And a lot of times their contracts are worded pretty much so that they can do anything they want. So if you look to the left of your screen, you'll see certifying and membership organizations. I'm going to go through each one of these more in depth towards the end of this presentation, but I'm going to go through them really quickly. So you have the American College of Veterinary Behaviorists, and you have the American Veterinary Society of Animal Behavior. That, compiled with the veterinarians found on Fear Free Certified, are going to be veterinarians who have way more experience, education, and understanding of behavioral intervention as well as behavioral medications. The Applied Animal Behavior Certified is the CAAB, and the big thing with them is that as a certified applied animal behaviorist, they should really be the only people that are calling themselves behaviorists. Now, in other countries, there's different groups that you can become a part of where you can be considered a behaviorist, and that's fine. But for the most part, it's somebody with an advanced level of education or degree. The IAABC is the International Association of Animal Behavior Consultants. The IMDT is the Institute of Modern Dog Training. The APBC is the Association of Pet Behavior Counselors. These are all organizations, as well as the CCPDT, which is the Certification Council for Professional Dog Trainers. The PPAB, which is the Pet Professional Accreditation Board, which is actually part of the Pet Professional Guild. And then there's the Professional Association of Canine Trainers, Association of Professional Dog Trainers, and the ISCP. Now, some of these are memberships that require you to be force-free, fear-free, or least invasive, minimally aversive, called LIMA. And what that means is, in order to be listed in their directories, you have to either have a certification that's verifiable through one of the other groups, or you have to attest that you only use LIMA, least intrusive, minimally aversive methods. And if you don't attest to that, then you don't get listed. And for those who are listed and have attested to that, there tends to be a ability for them to police their members. So if somebody brings up a complaint through those organizations that someone is using methods that do not align with their ethics, they can be removed from the membership organization. This allows for a level of accountability, in addition to the fact that almost each and every single one of these, except for some of the membership organizations listed, have a requirement for continuing education units that need to be met in a regular basis. So depending on how long your credential is valid for, be it a year, 2 years, or 4 years, you then have to have a certain amount of continuing education units that you take every year or every period that you have to submit for verification in order to renew your credential. So it's not just about money, it's just also making sure that you have access to the membership resources and support, but that they're also making sure that you are up to date on methods, methodology, and working with people and their dogs, and that you're doing so in a way that is maintaining consistency. I equate this to, you don't want to go see a neurologist who hasn't had a continuing education unit in 15 years. You want to go to somebody who goes to a conference every year or does their continuing education units online. It doesn't matter, so that they're up to date on the most current evidence-based methods for treatment for whatever you have going on neurologically. It's the same thing with your dog, because if somebody is using methods from 30 years ago, they're likely not going to be current, more humane, probably not going to be the most humane methods, and they're probably going to be less effective and successful if they're not using more up-to-date methods, which means that we've done the research to know that there's certain methods that we can use that are more successful and more humane, which makes them more ethical. So let's break down this word, least intrusive, minimally aversive, which is LIMA, LIMA the llama, or LASA. This is our kind of like the hierarchy of needs, which I will also be getting into later, but it's how we set up for the use of LIMA. And it's basically finding a way to prevent access to the unwanted behaviors, reward the proper behaviors, and set the dog and the human up for success. This keeps stress levels lower and encourages learning, because there's distress, which is where a dog is stressed out, or the dog is uncomfortable. It's the same for people. And then there's eustress, which is the healthy stress, where you're studying for a test, where the dog is practicing a behavior. It's the stress that occurs when learning is happening. Distress inhibits learning. So what we want to do is keep those stress levels lower so that we're in that eustress level, and encourage learning and learning retention in our dogs. Adding in positive punishment is a last resort, and that's only after using the community minds of professional organizations, veterinary behaviorists, etc., without ever sacrificing safety. So this basically means if I started out, I have a client calling me and saying, my dog is 5 years old and he's always been a little bit of a resource guarder with his food, but it's really never been a problem. And our daughter's now 2 and they've always been great together. Our other dogs have always been good together. And yet now my dog is chasing our other dog across the room and growling at us from the kitchen anytime that there's food around. So I'm going to go, okay, we have a change in behavior. Because changes in behavior don't always just come out of nowhere. It can either be slowly progressing or it's something that could be medically based. So we need to send them to the veterinarian. So that's this first little red tier, wellness, nutritional, physical. The dog needs to go in to the veterinarian. They need to have a physical exam done, make sure that we're ruling out pain, vision issues, hearing issues, things like that. And they need to have lab work done to make sure that we don't have anything internally going on that could be causing the behavior change. Because the last thing you want to do is throw money, time, and effort at training out a medical condition, because it doesn't work that way. The next thing we do once we have a clear bill of health is antecedent arrangement. Okay, so what that means is managing the environment. So how can I prevent my dog from growling over food? Well, food needs to be up and in a more controlled manner. So my dog can eat in their crate or behind a baby gate in another room. So until they're done eating, they don't have the ability to just run all over the house and do whatever they want. We're making sure that we keep everybody safe. It also allows us to address the behavior while we're working on making sure that nobody is getting injured. And keeping, again, those stress levels down, and adding in positive reinforcement strategies, which means that we are rewarding the behavior that we do want to see. So say your dog is fine with you until you're 5 feet from the kitchen doorway. So we can either move the dog into a different room, put a baby gate up, or put them in a crate, depending on, what your home style is going to dictate how you're going to implement environmental management. So say for this dog in particular, we put the dog in the crate inside the kitchen. And the dog is actually fine because they're now in a more confined space until you're 5 feet away from the crate. I'm going to at that point recommend, as an example, that we condition the dog to a treat and train device, and we put a really high value reward in that treat and train, which sits on top of the crate, or we're going to chop up a high value reward item and have it in hand so we can toss it into the crate from that distance. And that distance would be, 7 or 8 feet away before the dog is actually body language wise changing, because for a lot of triggering episodes like that, body language changes are at threshold. When you get barking, growling, and lunging, you're over threshold. Positive reinforcement can be used to teach a new behavior, to change an emotional response in an animal. And then we can pair it with an incompatible behavior. So say we need to work on the dog being able to back to the back of their crate in a stationing behavior so that we can open the crate door and without stress allow the dog out, and then remove whatever food dishes are in there after the dog is outside of the backyard. So we can teach the dog to go to a mat. We can put a mat inside the crate. We can have the dog target the mat and get paid while they're targeting the mat consistently, while we open the door, take them directly outside. Once they're outside, come back in and get the dishes. That's a form of an alternative behavior that is incompatible with the behavior they're currently displaying, while we're also managing it because we're not just reaching in and trying to touch the bowls. After we go through a situation like this, because again, these are levels of how we would handle it, normally for the majority of even behavior cases, that's kind of where we stay, under differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors and above. In cases where we are not getting success with that, we would first go back to the hive mind of our certifying body or organizations that we have memberships in and talk to colleagues and talk to other trained professionals and say, hey, this is the entire background on this dog, on their family, on the strategies we've implemented here. Can anybody else see something I'm not? And we're going to get tons of feedback, because we're going to go to people who have way more experience with this or have just, taken a class on XYZ, and they're going to be able to give us different options, and we can go back and talk to the owners about it. Because again, a training and behavior plan is involving the owner, the dog, probably their veterinarian, and a veterinary behaviorist if necessary. And that's going to happen before we get down to extinction training, negative reinforcement, negative punishment, or ever positive punishment. This is huge because it allows us to keep learning fun. It allows us to be proactive about safety, and it allows us to make the biggest impact on the dog without sacrificing mental health. Another commonly heard term is fear-free or force-free, and I want to make the distinction between LIMA, which is least invasive, minimally aversive, because if you look at that last slide, on the bottom there, aversives are potentially allowed. Now, I would consider myself to be somebody who follows LIMA, but I've never had to use an aversive in 16 years. I choose not to. I take into account the animal's stress levels when we are doing anything, from basket muzzle conditioning, because, you know, harness conditioning for our body, because the dog might find something that we're doing with a tool that would not be considered aversive to be something aversive to them. And so I have some dogs that are very noise sensitive. And so to them, using a clicker as a marker is a no-go because it makes them very uncomfortable. So instead of counter conditioning and desensitizing to a clicker, which could put the dog in a state of stress where we don't want them, I opt to use a verbal marker and a hand signal to let the dog know the moment they've done something correctly, the dog is happy with that, they're learning well, and it's allowing the learner to make that distinction and being aware of the dog's preferences and sensitivities. Force-free and fear-free means that you are doing the most that you can to assess a situation to make sure that you are not putting undue stress onto that animal that's learning. And it doesn't matter if it's a dog, if it's a pig, if it's a horse, if it's a chinchilla, if it's a bearded dragon, a tortoise, a snake, a chicken, a rhinoceros, a giraffe, or a tiger. The same methods that we use for behavior change or teaching new behaviors is not species specific. Positive reinforcement works on people. You know, you work really hard at your job and you get a bonus, positive reinforcement. So you don't need any sort of special tools, collars, or anything to quote unquote communicate with your dog. And this is huge. A lot of force-free trainers, if they have owners who are really committed and they can look at the situation and say, hey, you know what? I have an owner who is willing and capable of allowing this extra time to do things off leash in the house first, and then build them off leash in the backyard, and then put them on the leash in the front yard after we've gone back and done the first 2 environments on the leash with the specific behaviors. That would look like teaching a dog how to do loose leash walking without a leash connection. So getting the dog in the right position, paying them out while they're paying attention to you while you're walking throughout the home, then doing the same thing in the backyard. And then once they've done that really well, go back inside the house, put the leash on, build it up again inside the house, do the same thing in the backyard, and then move to the front yard, because we're changing environments each time. But you're not using those tools to communicate. You're using them to provide a safety barrier for your dog so they can't take off and get hurt, to provide protection for your dog so that if somebody has an off-leash animal, your dog is safe, and to practice training on long lines and things like that until they're at the level where you could potentially do something off-leash. In addition, a force-free or fear-free training professional is going to assess the training methods and techniques that they use and the animal's response, which I just kind of covered, and allow the learner to determine if it is fear, anxiety, or stress inducing to the dog, and then change their approach to ensure that the dog is set up for success. They use antecedent arrangement, which is also known as environmental management, to prevent practicing unwanted behaviors, because if it's not being practiced, it's not being reinforced. If every time somebody comes to the front door and the dog is jumping on people and they're pushing it off and yelling at it, the dog's still getting paid. Negative or positive attention is still attention. And so when we change it to putting the dog on a leash and putting treats all over the floor in the back of the room while the guest enters, and the dog's got all 4 feet on the ground and they're scavenging and they're completely focused on something else until they're calmed down, we're now preventing the jumping on the people, and we're pairing it with an incompatible behavior of scavenging, and we're reinforcing the behavior of all 4 feet on the ground at the same time. They will never need to see your dog reacting or engaging in an unwanted behavior in order to address it. That also applies to LIMA, and the main reason behind this is because you do not need to trigger an animal or get them to engage in that when you know what you're doing in order to be able to properly address the behavior. They're never going to boink, spray, squirt, choke, correct, check, pinch, vibrate, beep, shock, or stim a dog. They will use positive reinforcement and negative punishment. They're not going to stray into negative reinforcement or positive punishment. And if they ever needed to do something like that, it's going to look more like this, because they're going to do it without the use of pain, fear, or intimidation, only after consulting with multiple other credentialed behavior consultants and veterinary behaviorists to ensure that every other avenue has been explored. And it's going to look like this. I'm walking my dog down the street and my dog starts to pull. So I stop walking. Now there is tension put on the leash, not because I'm yanking on the leash, but because I have stopped the walk. So technically that would be adding in the punishment of the tension on the leash, as well as the negative reinforcement of the walk stopping. Then that person is going to go back and they're going to be like, okay, the dog has now put slack back in that leash. It's not tense anymore. They're going to say, okay, let's go. That's going to be positively reinforcing the behavior as they continue to walk on. The stopping of the walk could also be, in this type of case, considered to be negative punishment, because you're taking something out of the equation, which is the walking on the leash, but it can also fall under the negative reinforcement category because it's taking something away that's unpleasant, which is the pulling on the leash. It's not necessarily something that's so unpleasant that we would normally consider that to be a normal strategy. Purely positive. So I want to preface this with, this is a marketing term and it doesn't actually exist, because you cannot work with an animal using positive reinforcement only. It doesn't exist. So if you look to the right, there's the 4 quadrants of operant conditioning. So we have positive reinforcement, which is adding good stuff to increase the behavior. Then we have negative punishment, which is taking something out of the equation to decrease a behavior. Now, the easiest one to do with this, because this is also the leash walking example, is asking your dog to sit. If they sit, you pass them a treat. They're getting positively reinforced for sitting. Now, if you ask your dog to sit, they don't do anything. They just stare at you. The treat's not being handed out. That's technically taking the treat out of the equation. So that's the negative punishment. Now, if you look to the right, positive punishment is adding bad stuff to decrease the behavior, which means that you could be adding the tension to the leash to get the walk to stop. In most cases, what positive punishment looks like is I'm going to jerk on my dog's collar, tell my dog no, add in something that's heavily unpleasant, such as an aversive. Again, force-free, fear-free trainers, LIMA trainers are not going to be jumping into that. Negative reinforcement is removing the unpleasant item to reinforce the behavior that you wanted to see. So if I'm putting that tension on that leash, and my dog finally stops straining on the leash and backs up just a little bit to put just a tiny bit of slack in it, I let go of the leash, I am negatively reinforcing the behavior because I'm taking the bad thing out, which is that leash tension, in order to continue on the walk. The concept that we don't tell our dogs no or offer a punishment when our dogs don't listen is something that was created by those who do not understand evidence-based training. I hear this a lot when I am working with clients that have had other trainers or other behavior people. They're not credentialed professionals, and I use that very loosely as behavior people. But it's something where they're told that purely positive trainers or positive reinforcement trainers don't ever tell the dog no. They're permissive, and that's not accurate. Being a positive reinforcement-based trainer, an evidence-based trainer, means that we're going off of all of the research that we have done to know what is the least stressful for dogs, and we know how to assess a dog and assess a situation, and also make sure that it's safe for the owner, because we have to understand that human beings have physical limitations as well. And as somebody who works with people within the disability community for service dog training, there is a huge level of thought, well, your dog needs to be placed on XYZ inherently aversive tool. I have clients who have one leg and one arm that can manage an extremely rambunctious giant breed dog without the use of inherently aversive tools. And sometimes that's something such as a 2-point connection on a harness. It is not the use of inherently aversive tools. Going back to this, using positive reinforcement and negative punishment means that we apply something that the dog likes to reinforce the behavior we want to increase and withhold those rewards from the dog if they do something we didn't ask for in order to decrease the unwanted behavior. We're not adding pain, fear, or intimidation. And I can't stress that enough because people will say, I am LIMA, which drives me insane, or I am science-based. And these are people who are advocating for the use of shock, prong, choke, stim, vibration, beep, whatever, boinking, squirting with a spray bottle, startling, using a penny can, etc. Those are inherently aversive tools or methods, and they are not addressing how to change the behavior and teach what you do want the dog to do, but how to suppress and stop the behavior you don't like. And the problem with that is that there's a whole bunch of fallout that comes from it. And while all 4 quadrants are considered to be in the science of training and the science of learning theory, it does not fall under evidence-based training. There are 27 studies that have been done that are peer-reviewed studies that have proven that positive reinforcement-based training and staying out of the realm of using positive punishment and negative reinforcement is not only more effective in the dogs long term, but is better on their mental health and has less fallout. So if we are going to be focusing on using those 2 quadrants and not on the other 2, a lot of it just has to do with making sure that we are constantly learning ways to manage things, address things, and do that behavior change that is successful for the dogs and the humans so that we're getting these really good results without adding a whole bunch of unnecessary stress. Balance training sounds amazing. When you think of balance, at least for me personally, I think of yoga. I think of being able to find that work-life balance, that balance between being a mother of 3 and having a farm and running a training and behavior business and making sure that, everything is getting done, like laundry and cooking, and the bills are all being paid and that everybody's poop is picked up and, all of those things. And so a lot of people hear balance training and they hear some of those terms that we discussed in the very, very beginning of this presentation. And balance training is a marketing buzzword. When we think of it, we think of those happy thoughts. It does not mean that when it applies to dogs. Those who engage in what is called balance training like to talk about how it's science-based or LIMA-based. Now, this is a generalization, and I want to preface this because I used to be a balance trainer when I first started out, and then I learned how to do better. And when I saw the massive improvement that I had, not only in my relationship with my dog, but in my relationship with my clients' dogs, by throwing all of those tools away and learning how to do things better in a better way for the animal and for the human counterpart that lives with them, it was a game changer for me. So there are always those who are on the fence and maybe unsure about how to go about looking at some things, in a more progressive manner. And a lot of it has to do with lack of support or access to education or understanding, because again, you can just decide to be a dog trainer. They might not know what certifying bodies are out there, things like that. So that doesn't make them a bad person. And it does not mean that they are, out to harm animals. It just means that they don't know better yet. Now, there are definitely still those who refuse to look and do the research, and those are the ones that you really want to stay away from. But you can politely decline people based on the information that you learn here today so that you can make the right fit for you and your dog, and you know what questions to ask. So, yes, it's science-based. It is not LIMA-based, because you are not going to be advocating for the use of inherently aversive tools without going through those steps that we discussed earlier and going back to the hive mind of your colleagues and other professionals and all of the organizations that you're a part of, and being able to say, What am I not seeing here? Can you guys give me feedback that does not involve the use of aversives? Because if you're in those, credentialing programs or certifying membership organizations, you're not going to be getting advice on how to use aversives in the first place. We just discussed those 4 quadrants of operant conditioning. And they'll talk about how all of them need to be utilized. And that's the main concept of balanced training, is that you have to work off of all 4 of them. You're not just choosing 2 or 3 of them, but you're working off of all 4 of them. And again, it can be done. You can do all 4 of them without the use of inherently aversive tools. But when you're using balanced training, they're using the cookies and the treats and the fun toys and the games, and they're also using choke chains, prong collars, which also are known as pinch collars, e-collars, boinking, spray bottles, things like that. Because that mindset is then the behavior that you don't want has to be corrected, not how do we prevent access to engaging in the unwanted behavior. And there's a heavy, heavy focus on correcting the inappropriate behavior. And again, that does not recognize the need for environmental management. It makes it more difficult for the learner, who is the dog, to understand what it is that they are supposed to do. And then if we use evidence-based training, terms that you will commonly find associated, spoken by, or published on the web or Facebook page by balanced trainers are buzzwords like positive only, leadership, corrections, communication, through the leash, pack, structure, boss, control, command, things like that. What we're seeing more and more is balanced trainers talking about how they use positive reinforcement and emphasizing that they do it very heavily, but they don't necessarily talk about the aversive tools they use until they have one-on-one sessions with you, and then they're putting it on your animal to show you how magical it can be. And behavior suppression will work in the short term, but it does not affect behavior change, and it doesn't last. So the biggest issue is when you're done training your dog should be on either a harness or a collar, for walks. They should be able to walk with you, even in more distracting environments. Obviously, if you have a reactive dog, we're going to have them on a basket muzzle for safety reasons, things like that. But you are not putting a dog on a prong collar because if you don't have the prong collar on, your dog won't walk politely, but they walk politely if they're wearing a prong collar, because that's not training. And so the dog understands the difference between those two things. The behavior has not been proved or generalized to multiple environments, and the behavior is dependent on that physical correction, which means that there is a threat of something unpleasant in order to maintain that behavior. And that's going to align with what your ethics are as a professional, how you're portraying, the choices we have, because just because we can do something and have it be effective doesn't mean that we should do something. Because if we can do something in a more humane and ethical way and achieve the same or better results, why would we not take that avenue? And that is something that takes time and effort. And a lot of that is not seen in balanced training because it's all about the quick fix. There's a lot that is not publicly discussed in their positions because they know that they'll have to defend it and they can't. So they do most of this work behind closed doors, and with a lot of people in general not disclosing what they're doing. This can happen frequently with dog daycares and boarding facilities as well. As someone who's done consulting with different facilities and is in a decent amount of groups that are daycare specific focused, because I do a lot of fear and stress reduction education for daycares and boarding facilities. This is one that I see a lot, and I mean a lot, is that people are going to take their dog to a daycare, and the daycare is using pet corrector sprays or penny cans or water sprays on dogs that are displaying unwanted behavior instead of addressing the need to mitigate those stress levels. And that can cause a whole slew of behavioral issues on its own. I once had a client who boarded her dog at a vet clinic, and they had this huge big bay window where all the vet techs and the vet staff would walk by. They had a playroom there, and she had specifically said, my dogs are only going to be here for 3 days. I don't want them in the play group. I would just like them to stay in their kennels because I know how they are at home. And it's an issue that has just started with my one dog with our bay window in the front. And so because I don't want it to get worse, I would like for my dog to stay in their kennel. She came to pick the dog up. The dog was in that play area, and she heard her dog before she walked in the door. because anytime somebody walked by, her dog was scratching all over the window. And mind you, the dog was in there like 8 hours a day for the 3 days that she was gone, instead of being in his kennel. Even though she asked for it and she understood there was a restriction of activity, she was okay with it for being those 3 days, as long as her dog wasn't engaging in this. Then when she came home, she had to address it immediately by putting foam boards in her windows and taking the curtains up, because the dog was trying to rip the curtains off to get through the window, to bark at anybody and everything and scratch up the windows in a frenzy anytime somebody walked by. So it had actually took something that was easily managed and changed at that time when it just first started and turned it into a full-blown behavior problem. Verifying credentials, always recommended. There's still questions that need to go with those credentialed professionals. Some organizations have updated their positions and ethical standards of training. Some people have not yet adhered to that. So when you do ask questions, you know what to look for and can be better informed to know when to say stop and who to report them to. If you are finding that, say you have this one big certifying body and you've read their ethics and position statements that those trainers have to attest to, and somebody is telling you about dominance theory or pack theory or being the alpha of your home or using, an e-collar on your dog right out the gate, that's probably something that that organization needs to be made aware of. So why this is important, I put this little image here, which is learned helplessness, and it's basically an illustration of what this means. And this has to do with dogs who basically are helpless in avoiding something unpleasant, and so they just take it. And a lot of people go, my dog doesn't, it's not bothering them. They know that they're going to go out on their walk. Okay, but if your dog gets out on their walk and the only way they're getting out on their walk is in that e-collar instead of on a leash, your dog is going to put their head in the e-collar because it's the only way that they can gain access to going outside. It doesn't mean that they're completely shut down. It just means that they can't avoid it and they know that they're not going outside unless they're wearing it. So there you go. This was actually a study. We've done a lot of really barbaric studies on animals, but this is one of them. And so basically this little cage is divided. The floor on one side is electrified and the floor on the other side is not. So what happened was they had a divider in the middle. The dog sat on the floor and it was electrified, and the dogs could not get away. They could not escape. And they very quickly learned that no matter where they went in that kennel, they were being shocked. It didn't matter where they tried to go to, they were being shocked. So when they removed the divider, the dogs just sat there, because to them, the entire floor was shocked and they were helpless to avoid it, so they just given up, even though the other side of the floor wouldn't have shocked them. They don't know that because they have fallen into learned helplessness. So now that you're probably more confused, what does that mean? And I say when you are looking, there's some easy red flags to spot. Types of tools you should actively avoid. If you see squirt bottles, air horns, choke collars, prong collars, alpha rolls, beating, smacking, screaming at, shock collars, citronella collars, or vibration collars, and a lot of them nowadays look more like the tracking devices that are meant to be for, GPS if your dog gets out, or devices that are meant to track your dog's activity throughout the day, but are actually shock collars. And behaviors that should raise those red flags: collar pops or jerks to your dog for corrections, allowing your dog to react to correct it, videotaping your dog reacting instead of having you redirect and give more distance. So instead of focusing on you and the dog and what you're paying for, they're focusing on getting video footage, which goes into marketing. Magical looking before and after videos, and needing to see the behavior to understand it. Now, there are very few times where that is going to be something that somebody says. If they go, hey, do you have security footage of the bite that occurred? That's different. They're not asking you to reenact it to get it on video. They're saying, do you already have video somewhere of some sort of behavior or incident that's occurring via home security camera, video footage you took yourself, whatever. Problem behaviors are natural behaviors. So unwanted behaviors like jumping on guests when they enter the house are normal. But what we can replace it with is sitting on a designated space away from the door when guests arrive. Barking at the doorbell as a normal behavior for dogs. Barking is normal. What you can teach instead is for the dog to grab a toy when someone rings the bell. So they're putting something in their mouth and they're going elsewhere to do something instructive. Chewing on wooden furniture. Well, chewing is a normal behavior, so chewing on proper chews just for them from an easy to access basket or box. I like the 3 for 3 rule, which means 3 different types of toys for 3 days and then switch them out so your dog always has something new and always has something to engage in. Digging holes in the garden. Digging in a dig zone is an alternative that you can make for them that pays them for digging there and nowhere else. So if your dog is digging somewhere in the shade and it's moist, it's because they're trying to cool off because they're hot outside. So give them a dig zone, either in a similar area or similar type area of the yard where you keep it nice and moist and cool and shaded, and also put a bunch of treats and chews in there so that they're getting paid for digging there and not anywhere else. The concept of a tired dog is a happy dog. No. Anytime you see this from someone, unless it has a direct correlation to mental enrichment, run away. It's a myth. There's nothing that you want less than to have a dog who is constantly tired, because a dog who is constantly tired is more likely to become a dog who is suffering from pain, has fatigue, who can have aggressive or reactive episodes, because just like when we get overly exhausted and we get irritated way more easily, so can our dogs. While physical activity is essential to a healthy dog and a healthy lifestyle, some of the major problems that occur from this concept are: the more you walk the dog, the more stamina the dog builds. So if you run your dog 2 miles a day, eventually 2 miles a day is not going to wear them out at all, and you're going to have to increase it. If you have a dog that you run and you increase the distance until you hit 10 miles a day, all you're going to need to do is increase the distance and pace, because you're creating a super Hulk dog with an insane level of stamina. Now, if you're planning on doing sled dog races or, go on extreme hikes or whatever with your dog, then that's fine. You're building up that stamina because you have a specific goal in mind. If you're trying to do it so that your dog doesn't engage in unwanted behaviors at home, yeah, that's not going to happen, because the day that you need to take a day off, your dog is going to have all this energy and nowhere for it to go. When physical activity demands on a dog's body are that high, the dog needs to eat more to meet their caloric needs. They're more likely to suffer from arthritic conditions and paw injuries due to the level of intense activity. And it still does not address the underlying reasons for the unwanted behavior that sparked the concept to start with anyway. So if the activity need isn't met yet, you're still going to have the same problem. Okay, so buzzword breakdown. Good things to look for: force-free, fear-free, or LIMA, credentialed, certified, positive reinforcement, evidence-based, humane, and ethical. Red flags: balanced, dominance, pack, or leadership, or any variation of that, correct or correction, communicate through blank tool, be it a collar, a prong collar, a specific type of leash, invoking communication when it applies to like management gear, because like you're not walking your dog on a leash because they maybe need to be on a leash, but because there's ordinances and laws and things that require it for safety. Stubborn or hard-headed, master trainer, or guarantees. Questions to ask, and this is a big one. So there's a few of my top questions that I recommend asking besides the normal, like how long have you been doing this? Are you experienced in this type of training? If you're looking for an agility trainer, that's going to be your question. Are you experienced in agility? Have you ever competed in agility? Or do you teach rally classes? What is your experience with rally? Or have you dealt with aggression cases before, or reactivity cases? For how long? How many dogs can you project that you've worked with on this, etc.? And these are going to be things, if they say that they're certified or credentialed over the phone, in text message, email, or on their website, ask through who if it's not abundantly clear, make a note, and verify via that organization. Read the position statements of that organization to determine if it's ethical and humane practices that they focus on or freedom of choice. That way you know who you should be looking for and who you shouldn't. Being able to start your own organization and say, hey, we support, the use of prong collars for everybody. Everybody should have prong collar. Prong collar is amazing. That's going to be, totally legal to have that, and people can pay their membership dues and become a part of it. It does not mean that it's an ethical or evidence-based group. And so reading those position statements are really going to help you determine if you want to find a professional from one of those organizations. Ask if they guarantee results. They should not be guaranteeing results since behavior is not static and it is completely dependent on the owner following through and maintaining the behaviors that are being taught as well as what they're learning. Do they require before and after videos? Now, some professionals will record every single in-person session, and that's more for a liability standpoint or case study standpoint if they're dealing with behavior cases, things like that. So do they require before and after videos or recording? And if so, the focus might not be on your dog and you as much as the results from the film. So ask if they're filming for case notes or if they're filming for marketing use. Ask them how they would respond to a dog who doesn't seem to be understanding what is being taught to them. And the same goes for the owner. If the owner has a physical limitation that necessitates thinking outside the box for how to teach something, ask. If an owner is uncomfortable with any of the equipment recommended, say they have a dog who's really body sensitive and the first recommendation is to put the dog on a harness, and they say, well, my dog has a really hard time with the areas of the body being touched with this type of harness, and say that they're talking about a Julius canine harness. Is that professional going to be advocating for something lighter weight and thinner, like a Y front harness, or are they going to recommend switching to just a flat buckle collar, or are they going to recommend some other tool? It kind of opens the window into how their thought process goes, or what type of questions they would need answered in order to make a determination. Are they licensed as a business and insured? And this one is huge because if something happens while you're working with a trainer, you want to make sure that your dog is covered. So if something happens to your animal through no fault of your own, you want to make sure that this is somebody who has business coverage, and they're not just Joe Schmo saying that they're running a business, giving it a name, and have absolutely no footprint to their existence besides a social media page. I know this was a lot packed into this short video, so if you guys have any questions, feel free to email me at info@allbigcanines.com or post it as a comment to this video, and I will check in as I can. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to listen and would enjoy any feedback that you have. And I hope you enjoy the rest of this really awesome conference that I am so far really loving.